Welcome back to our afternoon session. Very pleased to introduce this afternoon Professor Robert Lerman. Dr. Lerman conducts research and publishes on employment, income support, and youth development, especially as they affect low-income populations. Dr. Lerman was one of the first scholars to examine the factors leading to unwed fatherhood and the effects of early unwed fatherhood on earnings. His work on youth apprenticeships in the late 1980s encouraged the creation of national school-to-work programs. Dr. Lerman's current research focuses on interactions between job and marital stability, the effects of marriage promotion programs, and youth transitions from school to career. The author of more than 150 articles, monographs, reports, reviews, and conference papers, Dr. Lerman has held dual appointments with the Urban Institute and the Economics Department of American University since 1995. Dr. Lerman has served on a variety of panels and commissions, including the National Academy of Sciences panel looking at the nation's post-secondary education and training system for the workplace, and on the board of the National Fatherhood Initiative. He's testified before congressional committees on such topics as youth apprenticeship, child support policies, and information technology labor markets. And today he's going to be speaking to us on the interactions between healthy marriages and healthy economies. Please welcome our speaker.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's going to be a challenge to follow Frank, who did such a lively job and dealt with issues directly relating to your own lives. I'm going to talk to you as an economist, and you may have heard the fact that a great author once said about economists, that it was Oscar Wilde actually, that economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I hope by the end of this talk you'll feel that I'm a bit different from that, because I'm very concerned about this issue, and I think it's very inspiring to see all of you here and be a part of this very interesting network. It's my first introduction to it, and I'm really glad to be a part of your conference. So I thank the organizers for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about economics. To me it's interesting, but I hope it's interesting to you as well. We hear a lot about the economy, and the newspapers are dominated by stories about the economy, and if it's not about our economy, it's about the European economy, and if it's not about the European economy, it's about Asian economies. So in a way, you can't get away from it. But what I want to talk about is that economics is not just about consumption, production, employment. Economists do concern themselves with broader human welfare considerations, poverty. There's a growing literature on happiness and there's a growing literature on the issues involved in self-control as well. So all that being said, the focus is often very narrow, and in particular, one area that gets downplayed, though there is a subgroup of people that worry about these issues, is the role of the family. And I recall coming here some years ago for a conference on family businesses, which has been underplayed in much of economics. So in my view, the result is a misplaced set of priorities and too little attention toward family functioning, and I'm going to try to persuade you of that today. I'm going to try to answer these 4 questions, thinking about healthy marriage as a high-yield investment. And to do that, we have to look at, well, what's the evidence? What's the evidence about the impact of marriage on economic welfare and the broader issues of well-being? I'm going to say a little bit about the last 2 questions. What are the commonalities between relationship skills and job skills? And then I'm going to talk about policy, public policy. You guys are engaged in private policies, which may be much more effective, but the two do interact, and we'll talk about their interaction. So again, we're first going to talk about marriage as an investment and evidence. So what do we mean by investments? Well, most economists would say that sound investments are the key to growth. Investments are about putting something aside today for yielding a flow of benefits in the future. So you sacrifice something today, maybe spending a lot of time looking for the appropriate investment, and invest in borrowing some money. Many of you may be taking student loans, so you're making an investment in yourself, in your own future. And that's one of the natural investments that economists talk about: education and training, plant and equipment, research and development, infrastructure. These are all investments in the sense that they involve doing something today for a flow of benefits in the future. Now, one of the problems about the future is that there is uncertainty about the future. So when you make these investments, you don't know exactly how they're going to turn out. Nonetheless, you'd like to find a way of doing it that's fairly low risk and high yield. So, as I said, a healthy marriage is like that in many ways. It requires upfront resources. You have to do a lot of search to find the proper long-term mate. And you have to invest in developing a close and healthy relationship. Like many other investments, marriage, which is what we're talking about here, does involve a serious commitment, and it's somewhat costly to reverse. I think there was some talk about cohabitation earlier today. Marriage involves much more of a commitment, and cohabitation may lead to more breakups, in part by the very fact that they're so easy to engage in, the breakups, that is. Whereas with marriage, the transaction costs of getting into marriage and getting out of a marriage are much greater. So in that sense, it's like an investment. But how does it differ from other types of investments? Well, some people might claim that it doesn't appear to have a direct relevance to raising the productivity of a country, but I'm going to argue that, in fact, it does, that healthy marriages have important indirect effects on productivity. And what I and all economists mean by the term productivity is getting more output for any given amount of input. So per hour of effort, per unit of material resources, you achieve a greater level of production, a greater value of goods and services. A second place where I think people have not highlighted sufficiently the interaction between marriage and healthy economies is in the area of the productivity of children. We're going to come back to this later, the reduced reliance on social benefits and income transfers, and the reduced long-term poverty and the effects of long-term poverty. But beyond all of that, marriage tends to have a very huge effect on happiness. And as I'm going to come back to, these effects that we've measured so far are for marriage in general, actually. They haven't been limited to what you might call healthy, happy marriages. Okay, so now let's go to some numbers. I'm not afraid of numbers. I hope you aren't. I like them. Maybe they'll wake you up in the post-lunch period. Maybe they'll put you to sleep, but I'm going to use them anyway. So when you just take a look at the data, on family incomes. And there's a lot of talk about family income. There's a lot of talk. Have any of you heard any discussions about income inequality in the last month or two? How many have? Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of discussion about that. How many of you heard discussions of income inequality in the context of marriage? One person. Couple people. Well, what you see here is wide differences. If you just look at the median income, the middle married couple in 2008, the income of that married couple was $73,000, almost 2.5 times the income of female heads of families and 1.6 times male heads. For married couples with a working wife, you had a median income of $87,000, 2 and 3 times the levels of family heads. So that's the first thing. Then, but you know, married couples, there's more than one person, so you have to adjust for family size. But even when you do that, you find very large gaps between married heads of families and units headed by unmarried people. Interestingly enough, this gap is much larger at the low end. So if you take a married couple at the 25th percentile of married couples and compare them with unmarried individuals at the 25th percentile of their distribution, the gap is much higher than it is overall. These gaps increase with age, not surprisingly at the beginning. It's a bit smaller, but it rises very quickly to about 50% difference. This is adjusted for family size now. It also extends to Black and Hispanic families, and in fact, the gaps are even greater there. The median income of a Black married couple family was $62,000 compared to only $25,000 for unmarried female heads. So more than twice as high. And in fact, if you actually take a look at how much of the racial income gap is associated with family structure, you find that family structure accounts for almost as much as other factors causing black-white differences. I mentioned that the numbers show particularly low, particularly high gaps at the lower end, and that comes about when you look at poverty rates. You can see that the gap in poverty rates is tremendous. In 2009, if you looked at female heads with children under 6, you would find that the gap was something like, overall it was 39% versus 8%, and for those with children under 6, 51%. So 5 times the level. And if you look at chronic poverty, so sometimes anybody can have a bad year, but what about people that are poor for 3 years in a row? There the gap is 12.6 to 1 between single moms. And poverty rates do adjust for family size, so we're already adjusting for family size here. One of the big reasons why we see such a big difference has to do with two individuals working together versus one person trying to hold the whole family together. But there's a second reason, and one that I've studied in considerable depth, and that is the impact of marriage on the earnings of men. If we just look at actual work effort and employment, the numbers jump out at you. What share of married men are working, what share of unmarried men are working. How long do they work, and what do they earn? very big gaps. But there are two narratives about marriage. And we all have to be aware of these two narratives. One narrative is, this is quoting from a New York Times editorial some years ago about a public policy that I'm going to talk about later in the talk on healthy marriage. And here's what the New York Times said: encouraging poor people to get married and stay married through classes and counseling sessions ignores the main reason that stable wedlock is rare: the epidemics of joblessness and incarceration that have stripped these communities of what social scientists call marriageable men. So under this explanation, what you have is you have men who are not doing well. They're not marriageable, so they don't get married, and their partner, their female partner, does not want to marry them, and they, it's just because they're not very good at, or at least earning money, and maybe worse, by having gone to jail. Now, the alternative view, so that's saying that it's bad labor market outcomes causing low marriage. Okay? The alternative view is, well, maybe it's the casual attitude about marriage and about couples and about having a stable family that's causing you to do badly in the labor market. Okay? So these are two different effects. The second one emphasizes that marriage itself may affect how well you do and how stable you work. So is marriage or something else the cause of these problems and of these differences between married couple families versus unmarried individuals? Now, this is not an easy problem to solve as a social scientist. We can't simply randomly assign people to marriage and to not marry. Draw them in and say, okay, you guys get married. You guys, we make sure you're not going to be married. So we can't do that. And we could, and there are some efforts in this direction, we could bring in a bunch of couples and help some of them with the skills they need. I'm going to talk about that later, and maybe more of them will get married, and that might be a way of also isolating this jobs effect. What we can do is capture the impacts of measured variables, such as education, so we can compare people with the same education, age, race, even the same performance on skills tests, a variety of skills tests. So we're looking at within each of those categories and say, even within that group, so you're just as capable on skill tests, you have the same level of education, you're living in the same area, you have the same age, you have the same race or ethnicity, immigration status, and so on. And are there any differences? But that only gets you part of the way. And the reason for that is that there may be some unobserved factors or difficult to observe factors in databases, such as motivation, looks, a good sense of humor, that might cause you to do well both on the job and in marriage, or in finding a good mate. So maybe the men who have the same education, test scores, everything else, the ones that marry are the ones that are better motivated, have a better sense of humor, and so on. So that's one problem, which we call unobserved factors. A second problem is the simultaneity issues, namely that earnings may affect marriage just as marriage may affect earnings. So that's the broader view. Okay, so one thing that I did some years ago, and it was followed up by some other efforts more recently, is to say, okay, well, let's abstract from all that. Let's just take whole populations and see what would happen if the tendency to marry in a recent year would be the same as the tendency to marry in, let's say, 1972, when the marriage rates were much higher, especially among families with children. And we'll just take what people actually earn, even today. So we're not going to take any causal impact of marriage on earnings. We'll just see what would happen if people paired up. Would they be able to at least reduce poverty and reduce inequality? And so what I did was I decided to be the grand matchmaker and simulate marriages in the data. I felt a very powerful feeling there. So I saw the patterns of who married who normally, and then I took women who were not married in a later year, and I simulated who they would marry based on their characteristics and the characteristics of men. And I brought up the marriage rate from this low level of the late 90s to the much higher level of 1972, and I asked, how much of a reduction in poverty would there be, and how much of a reduction in inequality would there be if you did that? And it turned out it was very striking. And in fact, instead of child poverty going up as it had over the period, it would have gone down. And also about half of any change in inequality was associated with this change. More recently, some people have replicated the approach and found that, again, in 2000, here's some numbers, 11 million children lived in poverty. If you increased the number of children living with two married parents, just to the, so not everybody would be in married couple families, but it would just go back to the 1970s share. That alone would deal with about 30% of the poverty problem. So then another set of studies that I did dealt with the issue of material hardship, and I asked the following question: is marriage protective against the experience of material hardship? What do I mean by material hardship? It's the inability to pay the rent, possibly get evicted, not having enough money to buy meals, having utilities shut off. All of these kinds of things are now in the literature called material hardship. Now, it's not surprising that married couples, married parents have fewer material hardships, but when you compare even those that have similar incomes, married couples and unmarried couples, so now I'm already biasing the measure against the married couples, still married couples experience less hardships. And what I found was that they're, not surprising, you don't have to be a genius to sort of think of the hypothesis. It's a bit harder to prove it, but that they had a lot more connection with family and friends that could help them in a difficult situation. This is some graphs, and this is by education. And these are the red bars. The blue bars are hardship, material hardship by people with high school graduates or less, no more than a high school education. And the red bars are for high school, some college. This is for couples, all of whom are below, or families, children, all of whom are below 150% of the poverty line. And even among this group, the experience of material hardship is much lower among married couples. This is among high school dropouts. So this is, can you meet your basic expenses? That's in the blue, and in the red, you were either evicted or you feel like you need to move. That's in the red. So these are some of the factors that cause hardship to be less even for low income, less educated parents. The low income tends to be more temporary. And I kind of referred to that when I talked about chronic poverty versus annual poverty. A two-parent family may experience 1 year of poverty, that's not good. But it's rare that they experience more than 1 year in a row. Household status tends to be much more unstable for unmarried than for married parents. And as I mentioned, married parents are more able to draw on help from family, friends, and community, so that even when you have low income, marriage tends to reduce the risks for couples and parents. So then another thing I looked at was the issue of long-term effects and unmeasured differences for young women, especially. So what I did, I looked at the cohort born in the late 50s and the early 60s, partly because we had data where we've interviewed these individuals now from 1979, I guess about 30 years. But when I did this study, I focused on the 80s and 90s. And the survey is called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and I had 17 years where I observed them, and I looked at women who had a first pregnancy leading to a birth after 1979. And I focused on about 2,000 women in the sample that had a first pregnancy before leading to a birth, so it wasn't it wasn't a stopped pregnancy for whatever reason. So they had a first pregnancy leading to birth, and that pregnancy occurred before a first marriage. So it was an unmarried pregnancy. And I looked at whether they got married. Now, before we go into the actual results, let me just say, at least for that cohort, marriage does occur. I mean, there's a high incidence of ever getting married. But there is a key issue in the timing and the duration of marriage, especially when you're raising children. So what I looked at was, okay, let's look at the women. These are all women who conceived before marriage. So that's the overall group. And let's look at those who got married within 9 months of the birth, and then follow them for the next 17 years. What I found was that even mothers who got married right in the aftermath of the birth of the child, or between pregnancy and birth, they had a much lower likelihood of being single parents, and they had a much higher income. So even for mothers with very low academic skills, those initially married have long-term incomes 66% higher than those who were initially cohabiting. And so even those who were in, quote, shotgun marriage, have you ever heard of that term anymore? Shotgun marriages? Okay. Did better than those not marrying in the early stage. So sometimes you hear this comment, well, if you marry young, you're more likely to get divorced. But if you don't marry, you're even more likely to be a single mom for a long period of time. What I actually did was not just look only at all of these women who had premarital pregnancies, but I actually looked at their characteristics and I matched them up. So I had a match of those who, I looked at the probability of getting married. And I only compared those who had the same probability of getting married, those that did actually get married, and those who didn't, but had characteristics such that they were in the same group. And that's how I found the results that I did. I compared the economic outcomes of those who actually married and those who did not. And again, not surprisingly, since I'm up here talking about the benefits of marriage, I did find very large impacts over time in reduced poverty, higher income, and so on of those women. Let's see, where are we in time here? I'm going to have to move a little faster. As I mentioned before, I've done a lot of work on looking at the causal impact of marriage on men's earnings. A simple model, which is used to justify the impact of education on earnings, is called the human capital model. What this human capital model does is takes what we call the logarithm of earnings. So we're looking at earnings in percentage terms. That's all that means. We're looking at earnings in percentage terms, and we control for work experience, the square of work experience, because work experience tends to cause you to increase your earnings, but then the impact levels off over time. So we get a nonlinear relationship. And years of schooling. That's the human capital model. And that model has been applied in hundreds of studies across countries, and what you find is a very high percentage gain to each year of schooling, on the order of, say, 8 to 9% per year, and that's considered a very high rate of return. Now, when they do that, they don't always test for the capabilities of people, these unmeasured variables that caused people to stay in school longer. But even when they do, you do find big schooling effects. If you look at men's earnings in the same way, what you find is that marriage increases earnings by over 40%. Now, I wouldn't claim that that is all causal. As I mentioned, there may be other factors, and there have been a variety of efforts to take into account these unobserved impacts. One actually was quite inventive. It looked at twins, identical twins, that grew up in the same family, and they looked at the marriage premium for men in that context, and they found a 26% marriage wage premium for men. We looked at it in a more elaborate way, bigger sample, and these are some of the reasons why marriage could have an effect, especially on men. By the way, you don't see an earnings effect on women. That is, women who are married do not earn more than women who are not married. But these are some of the factors that might strengthen the responsibility of men, their incentive to invest. It might reduce their instability on the job, and there's a lot of other issues there. So I've published a couple of articles on this subject, on the dynamics of marriage. And just to give you a flavor of the results, I looked at, my colleague and I looked at how marriage affects men's working hours, their wage rates, their entry into marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Now, what we were able to do is not compare you with somebody else who might have a better personality, a better sense of humor, just a better efficacy, a better, more organized. We compared you with yourself. These are called fixed effects in the statistical literature, where we look at, we're holding constant for your individual aspects, for your individual, what we call unobserved variation, and we look to see whether entering into marriage has an impact. Okay, we're looking at you, but we're looking at lots of yous. So looking at lots of people, and we're able to isolate then statistically the causal impact. And what we find is that there's a big impact on the hours that men work and on the wage rates. It's not as big as the 42% that doesn't control for your own individual characteristics, but it is about half of that, maybe about 20%. We do find, by the way, some evidence for the other directional effect, namely that added earnings power of men raises their likelihood of marriage. Although there is some recent literature that, very interesting literature, that looks at, well, what happens with high unemployment? If raising men's earnings causes them to marry, does losing earnings cause them to divorce? And this is very, as the previous speaker said, context specific. When the job losses are related to higher unemployment rates, actually the divorce rate has declined. Maybe divorce gets too expensive, but in any event, divorce tends to decline. Overall, what you find is that the earnings gain is on the order of 18 to 19% over remaining single or divorced. And interestingly enough, and I think this really reinforces the effect of marriage, is that remarriage also raises earnings. And that's, you might think of as either a little surprising or more evidence for an effect of marriage. Now, all of this relates to marriage per se, not to whether you have a good quality of marriage. And one might expect that if you have one that is a very healthy marriage, very happy marriage, maybe that the gains would be more because you might be able to invest, take a longer term outlook and so on, not get mad all the time and be late for work. Or maybe less. Maybe you say, well, you know, the job is not so important. I love spending time with my wife. And so maybe they would earn less. We just don't know the answer to that. I've been doing some preliminary work on this in a low-income population. I'll come back to that. Okay, so far, you probably think I'm a regular economist, so because I'm talking only about income and earnings. But as I say, people don't live on bread alone, and there is another big area that economists have been studying in recent years. It's the happiness literature. I'm sure in part this is because economists discovered data sets where they ask about happiness, and economists like data sets. So there are these two authors, Oswald and Blanche Flower, that wrote an article in 2004 in the Journal of Public Economics, where they look at the factors that affect happiness. And they can actually estimate the impact in dollar terms. Well, how would you think of doing that? Well, the way they do it is they control for income, and they have a statistical regression and an equation where if you have more income, how much more happiness do you get? And it turns out that income per se, although it does increase happiness somewhat, not as much as you would think. Much bigger are the impacts of unemployment and divorce, and they say here that a lasting marriage compared to widowhood as a natural experiment, for example. So why do they say that as a natural experiment? Well, that's because they don't want to say that it was a marriage that, you know, was unhappy, or, you know, it said something about you that you got divorced. It says something about the the natural experience of divorce, they find that it's equivalent to $100,000 a year. Now, how could that possibly be? Well, it's basically the way they come to that is that they compare the happiness gain with the happiness gain from income. And since the income gains doesn't raise happiness nearly as much, they find the marriage effect being very large. And then I just found a more recent article that also found something like a 50%, that you'd need a 50% boost in income to offset not being married. This is just on happiness now. There's also lots of evidence about, how much time do I have? 7 more minutes, okay. There's also a lot of evidence on other social factors. A recent study found that looked at non-marital fertility in crime and asked the question, had non-marital fertility remained at its 1960 level, what would have happened to the murder rate? And you can see there was, would have been a lower murder rate than there actually was. It's about maybe 8-9%. Health. Health is a very big factor. There have been review papers on that, and I think there's the reference I'll be happy to give you. It's in my overall review paper, which I did send to Shireen. And what you find there is that mortality rates are much lower for unmarried, much higher for unmarried men than for married men, and much rates for married women. Oh, that's a mistake. Their rates are 50% worse for unmarried women than for married women. Now, you might say, well, the people who are not very healthy are the ones that don't get married. But in fact, you can have what we would call negative selection as well. Sometimes people that know they need support are more likely to get married, and there's evidence for that. But again, we find a lot of evidence that this impact of marriage on health is a causal impact. It's not just an association. There's a big association, but there's also a causal impact as well. And here we do have some evidence about harmonious marriages conferring high health benefits. Childbearing and marriage interact. I've already referred to that. Today, non-marital births make up about 40% of all births, and the gap by education is particularly wide, with births to college graduate women only about 7%, non-marital births to college grad women only about 7% of total, and non-marital births to less educated women over 50%. And this pattern is widespread in Europe as well. So much so that many commentators, including me, are saying that marriage is replacing race, class, and neighborhood as the key to inequality and immobility. Now, one factor that's affecting child outcomes is the fact that if marriage helps on the income side and reduce poverty, that in itself will help kids grow up better. So that's one thing. But let's leave that aside, because presumably benefit programs could narrow the gap in income. Let's look beyond income, and Sarah McClanahan, who's here at Princeton, has pioneered in research on this subject and has clearly shown that the negative impacts on children's subsequent educational outcomes and family outcomes of single parenthood, and especially compared to biological parents, are quite negative. And that's even taking into account income differences. So these are some of the factors that would cause that to be case. So with all of this, you can see that there's a lot of long-term benefits of a healthy marriage, and some of these benefits flow beyond the individual to the next generation, and some of them flow even into public programs and to bring people outside your own family. So why, given all these benefits of these good investments, if marriage is so good, why don't more people do it? That's the way economists think. So we have to look at that question. And I think that there are a lot of potential answers. I couldn't even go into all the answers in the short time here, even if I were smart enough to know all the answers. But these are some of the factors that I think come into play. One of the things that we want to avoid, though, is do no harm. We want to do no harm. We don't want to make matters worse. And in some cases, public benefit programs do that. And so we want to limit that. So how do we do that? Well, there's a whole movement that has arisen. Maybe you're part of this movement. I learned about it called the Smart Marriages Movement, that emphasizes the role of teaching relationship skills. I asked Professor Fincham if his material had made it into all the curriculum, just a few. And so we're still learning about this, but this is one of the efforts, and they're mainly oriented to teaching communication skills, finances, dealing with issues of fidelity, how to deal with children, and so on. Interestingly enough, many of these skills are the same skills that you need to do well in the job. So there may be a complementarity. This is stuff that's just emerging. If you look at one of the key things that's valued most, it's the applicant's communication skills and the applicant's attitude. So how can we help? And I'll, last 2 minutes or so. Huh?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So interestingly enough, people in the government recognize that the erosion of marriage has not been a good thing, and that we might try to do something about it. Beginning in 2002, led by Dr. Wade Horn, who actually had started the National Fatherhood Initiative, he created something called the Healthy Marriage Initiative. The Congress has provided funding for this. I encourage you to go to the website, acf.hhs.gov/healthymarriage, and you'll see a huge amount of activity up there trying to look at what can be done, especially in the low-income population, to strengthen marriages, to encourage healthy marriages. One of the initiatives has been to fund 3 major evaluations. These 2 are random assignment evaluations, where applicants were assigned to have access to a strong relationship skills program, and others not, and the Community Healthy Marriage Initiative, where there was an effort to have a saturation of these marriage services. I would say that this is not something that is pushed on people. If you look at polls, low-income individuals express, single moms do, express a very high rate of interest in having available to them classes that teach these kinds of skills. Unfortunately, the results so far have been mixed, and sometimes early results, you only get one time to make a first impression, and the first impression on a lot of policymakers is that these things don't work. And that comes about from the early impact results of building strong families. This was an experiment with couples that were unmarried, or at the time of the birth of the child, or about at the time of the birth of the child. There's a lot of literature that these couples are actually very close and very engaged with each other at the time of the birth. Even though it's an unmarried birth, about over half are living together, and another 30% or so are in very close romantic relationships. The fathers are there at the birth in the hospital. They express an interest in raising a great child and being together, and even in getting married. Now, unaided, we know the vast majority of them do not get married. In fact, the father leaves after a period of years. It's gradual. So this was a group where it was thought, well, if we can do something at this kind of magic moment where they just had the birth, everybody has a happy glow on their face and are ready to engage, maybe that could have an impact. But overall, in 8 sites, there wasn't an overall impact. There were some impacts for some important groups, in particular African Americans, and in Oklahoma. There are also some experiments with some positive effects, and I can go into these in the questions if you want me to. In particular, there was one very interesting experiment where the groups were given either no services or not hardly any, services about parenthood and fatherhood in particular, or services that dealt with parenthood but mostly about couple relationships. So we have 3 groups: no service, parenthood, parenthood plus couple relationships. And they looked at the impact on children. And the impact on children was most positive where the couple relationship emphasis was taking place. So, I mean, it sort of stands to reason that you might be a good parent and working with your child, but if you're fighting with your partner all the time, with your spouse all the time, that's not a great atmosphere for the children. So it kind of makes sense, and that was the finding. They also have done some experiments with the military. What I would say is that we're just beginning in this effort. We don't close down schools because they aren't effective. And we shouldn't close down something as important as helping people improve their relationship skills, understand the importance of marriage, and how to handle these difficult situations of child rearing. We shouldn't close that down before we have more information. You heard today just one aspect of what can be taught, this case of forgiveness, you heard that this morning, one aspect of how that could be embedded in a curriculum for people. And what's inspiring is to see all of you here, and you can really be a part of all of this. Hope that you can bring your energy to this movement so that we can have a better country for us all. So thank you very much.